Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. It's Thursday morning, July 8th, 2021. Good morning, Lyle. Good morning, Sheila, Gail, and the kids. Good to see you guys on here today. Hope everybody's doing well, and we are ready for 1 Timothy chapter 5 as we continue our study of what I've called letters to preachers. And I've done something a little bit different. I haven't done this but a couple of times, but I guess mainly because I forget to do it. But so I'm doing this live on our Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page, but I also cross-post to the Near Churches Facebook page. And so actually running on two different pages right now. I've got one open on my phone, and I'm looking at the other one here on my screen. So if you're on the Near Churches page and watching, you are more than welcome to ask a question, make a comment, and I will acknowledge them when I see them. As always, I have material. If you're interested in the material, let me know and I'll be happy to. I've already created a message group to send this stuff out to. I'll be happy to do that if you would like to have a copy of what we are studying together. But anyway, we are ready for 1 Timothy chapter 5 today. Working our way through this study. And Timothy, or rather Paul, to Timothy, hits a couple of different things here today in this particular chapter. In the first two verses, in writing to this young man, and I touched on this yesterday, that we don't know Timothy's age, but it appears from what Paul told him in chapter 4 and verse 12, let no man despise your youth, that he was young enough, it appears, that people could have used that against him in some way. And so in chapter 5, he addresses a lot of issues that might be challenging to a younger man who is working with a church. And of course, Timothy was in Ephesus. Paul left him in Ephesus to do some work. We learned that in chapter 1. Good morning, Shelley. Good to see you on here. And so he's going to address here in the first two verses Timothy's treatment of members of the church in general, of all ages. And so he says, do not rebuke an older man. I know the King James says elder, but this is not talking of the bishops or anything like that. This is just the older men, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters with all purity. And so the relationship, one of the things that I put in the outline is that the Bible does not segregate the congregations within the church. Now, good morning, Diana. Good to see you on here. I do think it's obviously wise for a congregation, hey, Owsleys, for a congregation to have Bible classes and age-specific classes. You know, there are some things that you would probably teach very young children that you probably wouldn't have in an adult Bible class, and vice versa. And so, the gospel's for all people. Timothy, in fact, when we get to 2 Timothy 3, he understood the Holy Scriptures from childhood. But, there's a lot that can be learned by the young from the old. Hello, Anna, watching from Tennessee. Good to see you. The young can learn a lot from the old, and it's interesting, and we'll talk about this when we get to Titus. In Titus chapter 2, in the first, 10 or 11 verses, to me, Paul lays out a great setup, if you will, for Bible class setups. Older men teaching younger men, older women teaching younger women. Anyway, just some thoughts that I had there, but age-appropriate classes, age-appropriate studies are a good thing, nothing wrong with them. But in the general treatment of everybody within the church, there's this idea here of mutual respect. Old for the young, young for the old. We're all in this together. We can learn from each other. We benefit from each other. We encourage one another. And Timothy is reminded of those things in those first two verses. And then beginning in verse 3, and I've got it divided up into two sections in the material. From verses 3 to 16, Paul addresses widows, but he does it in two ways. He addresses older widows and then younger widows. So we're going to break it up like that and discuss this particular topic. So verses 3 through 10, he talks about the older widows, or as he says, widows who are, King James says, widows indeed. New King James says, really widows. Well, what does that mean? Well, we'll see that here as we read through the text. And you can even go back to the Old Testament. You can look at Exodus. You can look at Deuteronomy. And then, of course, obviously in the New Testament, it appears to me that God has always taken special care, if you will, or had special concern for widows and orphans. And the way that he has cared for them throughout time is through the hands of his people. Exodus 22, you can read about it there. Deuteronomy 24, you can read about it there. I think of passages like James chapter 1 and verse 27. I think of 1 Timothy chapter 5. God has always, and not in showing partiality, but there are those who need care that are in positions or that find themselves in circumstances where they're not getting it. And so these older widows, one of the earliest problems in the church, if you remember, was the neglect of widows. That's recorded in Acts chapter 6. So this appears to have been an issue in the first century church. And widows indeed, or really widows. But then there's a caveat here. The church has responsibility, but there's a I guess you could use the term a mitigation to that. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. And so you really need to couple verses 4, 8, and 16 together. So that's what I'm going to do. We just read verse 4. You skip down to verse 8. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. You get down to verse 16. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them. And do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are widows indeed, or really widows. So familial responsibility is something seen throughout Scripture, and it's seen right here in the case of widows. There may be some who have no family to take care of them. The church then has responsibility, but there are certain qualifications, if you will, requirements, whatever, that are necessary to be met if that is the case. And so we read verse 4, take care of your home matters. If a widow has family, the family is responsible for them. But verse 5, now she who is a widow indeed, or really a widow, and left alone, trusts in God, and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in these things, but she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. So there's a contrast then even between certain types of widows, not only age, as we're going to see here, but their manner of conduct. Widows who are widows indeed, widows who rely on God and who pray, as opposed to those who live in pleasure. And so these things command that they may be blameless. The church has responsibility, but the first responsibility is to the family. And the specifically stated purpose is, in verse 16, that the church be not, I think the King James uses the word charged, maybe, in verse 16. The New King James uses the word burden. The family has the responsibility to take care of the widow. And here's the thing. Not only does the church need to understand that, and the family needs to understand that, the widow needs to understand that. If they have family, that's where the responsibility lies, with the family to take care of them. So let's talk about, what things are laid down by inspiration here about doing this. Well, here you go, starting in verse 9. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the husband, whoops, that came out wrong, and not unless she has been the wife of one man. I was reading 1 Timothy 3 in my mind, I guess, the elders being the husband of one wife. But the widow, now we're not told why specifically she has to be 60 or older. Probably has to do with the idea that she cannot work or work much at all to provide for herself, and so she truly needs assistance in the daily necessities of life. And unless she has been the wife of one man. Well, that's led to some interesting discussion and disagreement, as is not unusual. I think the wife of one man is the idea, just like is the case with the husband of one wife for elders and deacons. This is not a morally bankrupt person. This is a person who has lived a life that is in line with God's teaching on domestic affairs. Just like is the case with the deacons and elders, as recorded in 1 Timothy chapter 3. So no younger than 60, a domestically responsible and faithful woman. Verse 10, well reported for good works. Okay, she's got a good reputation for her faithfulness. Again, if she's and So it's categorized in different ways then, what it means to be reported for good works. She's brought up children, she has lodged strangers, she's washed the saints' feet. Okay, that's a life of service. Like John 13, when Jesus washed the disciples' feet, he didn't say, do what I'm doing. He says, do as I do. It's about service. Good morning, Diana from Jonesboro. Hope you're doing well today. Wash strangers' feet if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. So the requirements then are very clearly and unmistakably laid out there in verses 9 and 10 for the widows who are widows indeed, with no family, no one to take care of them. The church has responsibility. Now, what about younger widows? Well, that's verses 11 through 16. They were to be refused, according to verse 11. Well, they're in a different situation in life. They can probably work. They could probably remarry if they were, as we say, scripturally eligible to do so, as laid out in various passages of the New Testament. Why refuse them, though? I mean, they're widows. Well, again, he tells us, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. So it's a desire to marry, to have a relationship with a man. That could lead possibly to bad things. The idea of growing wanton is an interesting thought there. Desirous. Well, a younger woman may have certain desires that an older woman may not have. And so the church is to not take in. They are to refuse to be taken into the number. Remember, back up in verse 9, it said, do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number. Well, this is the opposite of that. So they could lose their focus in their Christian faith because they want to be with a man. They want to marry. But then also, besides, verse 13, they learn to be idle. The Greek term there literally means unemployed or without work, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle. Oh, hey, Diana, you're from Washington Avenue Church of Christ. All right. Well, glad you're here and glad you're there at Washington Avenue. Not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies and saying things which they ought not. Well, as opposed to being usefully employed and being a contributing member to society, they have employed themselves in running off at the mouth. They have responsibilities, again, as younger women with more physical capabilities, different desires in life than the older widows. So what does Paul then instruct in that particular case? I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, and give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. So take verse 13 of the younger widows and contrast that with verse 10 about the older widows. These are two completely different stations in life. The church has responsibility to one, and it does not towards the other. They can in essence, I guess the way I would say it is, they can take care of themselves. They need to get married, take care of the domestic responsibilities. And here's the warning, verse 15, for some have already turned aside after Satan. Don't be idle. And I guess that's true of all Christians. If you're able to work. If you're able to support yourself. If you've got family who can take care of you, that's where the responsibility lies. The church is to take care of widows who are widows indeed. Good morning, David. David says no Social Security back then. What if the family does not have the means? Should the church help? What if the family does not have means? Well, that's a good question. I think the church, the local congregation, the eldership will make those decisions accordingly. I think there's some room for common sense judgment there. Interesting thought, though, because there are situations like that. I've seen situations like that myself. But the primary responsibility it is at the feet of the family, if there is family at all. Good morning, Billy. Good to see you on here today. All right, so that's verses 11 through 16 on younger widows, older widows in the church, verses 3 through 10, and then he talks, beginning in verse 17, about elders. Now these are different from the elders of verse 1. Elders in verse 1, again, is just an age group in general. Verse 17 is the elders who rule well. So this is specific to the leadership of a local congregation. They are to be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in word and doctrine. And what he's talking about here, and we know it because of verse 18, is that a elder who has dedicated his life to the full-time, I guess we would say, service of the church, because that's what that position is. It's a position of service, leadership through service. They're worthy to be paid. And he quotes Deuteronomy 25. He quotes Jesus from Matthew chapter 10. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 9. Those who preach the gospel should live of the gospel. So elders can certainly be qualified to be compensated for their work in the church. Interesting thought there. Personally, I've never seen an elder who has been in that situation, but I'm sure it exists, and it's biblically authorized. Do not receive an accusation against an elder except from 2 or 3 witnesses. Now that's true across the board. I think of Matthew 18, verse 16. If someone who's offended you, they don't hear you, you take 1 or 2 more that every word may be established. This is a concept that comes from the Old Testament and so on, but here specifically it's applied to the eldership, men who are in that position. Those who are sinning, in other words, if it's a verified case of sin. Hello, Charles. Good to see you. I think, Charles, if I remember, you're up somewhere in Missouri. Glad to have you on here today. Those who are sinning, and again, this is in the context of elders, rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest also may fear. Well, an elder is a human being. He is capable of sin, and if he does, he is to be rebuked. And one of the stated purposes of that, obviously, is to deal with that individual's sin, but also that the rest also may fear. Hey, Brian, Mansfield, Missouri. There you go, Charles. Good morning, Brian. Good to see you. And so, sin is a reality in the life of everybody. Temptation, we can give in to temptation, and an elder is no different. And he too is to be rebuked. It's not you shouldn't avoid talking to an elder about sin because he's an elder. It doesn't work that way. Same thing's true with preachers and deacons. It's true across the board with every Christian. Sin that is not repented of needs to be rebuked, period. Doesn't matter how old you are, doesn't matter your gender, elder, deacon, preacher, whatever. Sin needs to be rebuked. I charge you before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels that you observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing with partiality. To me, the implication there is, I might be hesitant of talking to an elder about his sin because he's an elder. No, you do it without partiality. Sin is sin, regardless of who commits it, and it needs to be dealt with appropriately. And so don't lay hands on anyone hastily. And I think the laying on of hands here we're in the context of elderships. Titus was left in Crete to appoint elders. It's one of his works. And so the idea here is that you need to be very careful who is to be appointed as an elder. The Bible tells me that a preacher has a role in that work. It's possible to do that incorrectly. It's possible to appoint unqualified men. It would be better to have no elders at all than to have unqualified elders. Because if they're unqualified, frankly, you don't have elders in the first place. And so don't lay hands hastily on anybody. Don't put anybody in that position quickly without thinking it through and without following what he had written in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Nor share in other people's sins. Keep yourself pure. And that's, again, all in the same context of rebuking an elder who may be in sin. Then he gets a little personal with Timothy. No longer drink only water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities. 2 things I learned there. Number 1, Timothy had stomach problems. Number 2, Paul could have healed him, but didn't. Miracles were not just performed because miracles could be performed. You've heard me talk about that before in other streams. I did a series I did a few videos on miracles and the life of Christ and things like that. This is not permission to drink. I'm not even going to get into that discussion. Here's a way to treat your stomach problems, Timothy. That's it. That's what he's talking about. Some men's sins are clearly evident. I love what happens here in verses 24 and 25. These two verses are general truths about the presence of sin and good works, and they contain general truths about the judgment. And so some men's sins are clearly evident, preceding them to judgment, but those of some men follow later. We can't fool anybody, and some people don't try to fool anybody about their sin. Some people do. Well, it's all going to be laid bare at judgment. Well, good works as well, verse 25, of some men are clearly evident. There's no question that there are some people who are actively working for the Lord. It can be seen by members of the church. It can be seen by people who are outside of Christ, etc. It's clearly evident. And those that are otherwise cannot be hidden. Well, again, everything is going to be laid bare in the judgment. And so he covers a lot of different ground in 1 Timothy chapter 5, how to treat people of all ages, older widows, younger widows, responsibilities toward elderships and sin and things of this nature, and then judgment in general. That's a pretty wide range of topics that Paul covers to Timothy. But we've got to remember, going back to chapter 1, he left him in Ephesus with a certain charge. So this is all included in why Paul left him there and the work that Timothy was supposed to be doing. When you deal with a congregation, I'm just thinking here off the top of my head, when you deal with a congregation, you're going to deal with people who are of all ages, male and female, all different types of socioeconomic circumstances. And so we have these directions from the Word of God that they don't, we're not left in the dark as to what our responsibilities are to one another in the church, to those outside of Christ as well. We have a great deal of responsibility, but we have the instruction that leads us in the fulfillment of that responsibility too, and we ought to be thankful for that. All right, guys, that is 1 Timothy chapter 5, and this is Thursday. So I'm not going to be live tomorrow. We won't come back, Lord willing, till Monday at 11 o'clock. And we will look at 1 Timothy chapter 6, and we'll probably do that whole chapter. I don't see any further questions or comments. All the greetings. Glad to have all you guys on here today, both on the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring page, but also the Near Churches page. I think I'm going to start cross-posting like that every time I go live. But anyway, thanks for being on here today, guys. As always, you're welcome to comment on the stream here. If you have someone you think that would like to do these studies, but they do not do Facebook, send them over to our YouTube channel, Mammoth Spring Church of Christ, and all of this content is uploaded there. We've also gotten off the ground with a podcast based off of the Fulton County Gospel newspaper that I put out, that I edit every other month. We're on Podbean and Spotify right now. It's called the FCGN Podcast. So you can look that up. All that stuff's on our YouTube channel too. That's it. Guys, thanks for being here today. I hope to see you back here Monday. I hope you have a good weekend.